Oh, that's a good question too. So yeah, I'll cover both of those things. So yeah, so for the first one here, and again, if anyone has any questions while I'm going through this, just add them to the chat, and I will get to as many as I can. But the idea for animating is that any property that you select on any sort of object inside of Cinema 4D, if it has this little gray circle next to it, that means that it can be animated, or it means that you can set keyframes rather for it specifically. So right here, I have the size that I could animate, or if I go to the coordinates, I could animate the movement of it, or the rotation, or the scale of it. Any of these could be animated inside of Cinema 4D. And there is even a specific special layout for Cinema 4D that you can actually use for animating. And when we get into modeling, we'll have a layer that will be, or a menu that we'll be using for modeling as well. But for what we're covering right now, you don't even need to switch any of that to a specific layout. So I'm just going to use the same startup layout that everyone starts with, and I'm just going to move my cube from the left to the right. So I'm just going to move it all the way here to the left, set a keyframe by clicking this little circle here, moving my timeline to frame 30, moving my cube, and then clicking the circle again to set another keyframe, and you can see that a line shows up. And now if I go back to the beginning of my timeline by hitting this button over here, which is go to start, if I hit play, now I have a little animation on my cube, my scene. And this is the same process you would go through for animating anything inside of Cinema 4D. At least if you're setting keyframes. There are ways to animate without keyframes, and that'll be a more advanced thing that we go to. And this is how you would sort of start this up. Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, so to actually get this animation out, we've actually covered a little bit about this already. So you have to set up a path for your animation, or where your actual images are going to render, because instead of rendering one image, we're going to render a sequence of images. So in our output settings, most of the time we haven't really touched anything below maybe here really, but if you come down here, you'll notice that there's something that says frame range, and we would change this from current frame to all frames, or we could do manual and set a frame range. So I could do from frame 0 to 30. And now if I render this to the picture viewer, and I don't want it to save anywhere, now I can actually see that it's actually going to render out a sequence of frames. And this is what you would put into any program of choice in order to save out, say, a GIF or MP4. So if you were doing a GIF, you might want to bring this into Photoshop and render out a GIF from there, or you could bring it into After Effects or any program of your choice. But these images, which if you choose a place for them to actually save, which I didn't choose a place for them to save, but you would of course do that. Maybe turn it on alpha, then you could bring it into any other program and then save out a GIF. And we actually do have a lesson where you will actually be making GIFs for your actual brand assignments. So keep that in mind, that this will be a full assignment later on, but just to give you a little preview of it, since I know some people are more interested in this, this is actually the process that you would go through for actually doing that. Again, this isn't required, but just so that you're aware of it, because I know it is fun to make stuff move around in 3D. So that's the little quick explanation there on how to do animating using keyframes inside of Cinema 4D. And I'll even, just because I will save this and I'll put this in a collection that I'll share with everyone, just so you can see what I've done in class in terms of these little example projects, just so that you have something to reference. So I'm just going to hopefully wait for this menu to come up so I can tell it where I'm going to save it on my computer, and then I will jump to the next question here. Give it a second to respond. Come on. There we go. and I'll save this as cube animation. All right, pretty simple scene, but you'll at least have a reference for what I did during class. Okay, cool. So next question we have here is about, can you make a spline in an object so that you can use a selection on it? Yes, you can do that. There's a lot of different things you can do with splines. Let's see what I can create here as an example. So let's say we have pen tool. We come up to our top view here. And we'll make a shape here. And we'll just make some sort of weird shape here. So almost sort of like a C here, but a really sort of weird C shape here. Not really sure what type of shape that is, but it doesn't really matter per se. So the idea of creating selections on a spline. So there are a number of different ways you can do this. Let's see if I can do this the quickest way I would think of doing it, and if that would actually even work in this case, because I don't think it will. Set vertex weight selection. No, that's not what I want to do. So a couple of different ways you can do this. Of course, you can always sort of group selection of different items. That would be one way to do it. You could create different groupings of objects, so create multiple objects and sort of select them sort of that way. There is a way, and it's a bit more advanced, but let's see if I can find it real quick. I believe it's in create. Let's see if I can find where this is. I believe, let's turn that down a bit there. I believe it's in character tools. Let's see if we can find it. So there are a number of different tools that you can use in order to basically create selection sets, or I guess they're more so called clusters is what they're actually called. And that basically is a collection of points together that you can use in order to manipulate different things. It's a bit more advanced. So generally what I do, if I need to do selections, I would sort of, usually I just create sort of drag selections of the different areas, or I would create different, I guess, objects is what I would do. So I can actually right click and you can actually split in order to take different parts of your object individually. So let's see if I do this. So now I actually have another selection. Let's see if I can select it. Another selection of my original spline here. And because I had close spline on, it actually connected it. But you can see there that I actually do have a whole nother piece of my selection there. So that would be one way to create a spline object so that you can use a selection on it. Now, what you might not want to do is, if you're trying to extrude this method wouldn't work, because if you're trying to, like, say, color part of this versus a different part of it, this might not necessarily be the best way to go about it. Then you might have to get into more of a complicated way in order to basically add materials. So that would be maybe a more specific case where you have to tell me sort of what exactly you're trying to do, but you can use your splines as specific selections or add materials to those particular parts. But the cluster would be one of the things that you would use for creating spline selection points. The other thing, let's see if I can find it real quick, that you would use for that specific case would be probably express it would be the more thing, but that's a bit more complicated. I don't want everyone to have to deal with that per se yet. But there are also other ways that you can use in terms of constraining things or constraining different spline points so that they're connected to each other. That's also another way to do it. If you're trying to do it for animating, there's another way that you would do it as well. So there definitely are ways to do it. It depends on probably your specific case of what you're trying to achieve in this case. So not a quick answer for that one, unfortunately. But probably the splitting would probably be the quickest, easiest way to create, I guess, different areas of the spline that you can manipulate. So that is a good question there, though, for sure. I'll just save this just so I have a reference of what I did in class. Splines. Oh, colors? Okay, yeah, so for colors, if you're using splines, I would do probably multiple objects would probably do it. So I probably would just copy the spline, or you could even use instances. That might actually be the easier way. Like once you extrude it, use different instances because you can apply different materials on the instances of the object. That actually might be another way of doing it. But yeah, there's a couple different ways, and there is one way that's actually the best way to do it, but I don't want anyone to have to worry about getting into the nitty-gritty of modeling, at least not yet until next lesson. But yeah, so hopefully that helps at least a little bit there. And then the other question that I see here is from Evelyn, and it's asking about organic shapes like bread. That's a good question. So one question, so let's see, does Cinema 4D have bread? No, it doesn't have bread. Okay, so you can't get out of that the easy way, although I'm sure some of the other sites I mentioned would actually have bread in them. But what I would do if I was creating bread with everything that we have learned so far, because of course there are other ways of doing this, but let's say I wanted to create bread, I might come to, say, my right view here, and let's say I use my spline tool. Let's see if I can create sort of a decent profile for maybe a loaf of bread. Am I in the Bezier tool? I am in the Bezier tool. So let's say I go like this. I go over here. Yeah, let's say this is going to be my shape for my loaf of bread here. So we have talked about using splines. I'm going to actually show you one way that you might. Let's see if I make sure that this is on the world axis here. Okay, would help if I'm not selected in the tool anymore. Okay, cool. So let's say this is sort of in the middle of my scene here. Make that on the Z. So we'll say that this is my sort of shape for my bread that I might want to use. Of course, you can probably make a better shape for your loaf of bread than I can here. And actually what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to do a bit of advanced modeling here just so I can bring this point over here. And I'm going to show you a couple different tools that I might use. So let's say all I know how to do is to use splines, and I want to use this in order to create my loaf. So let's say that this is one half of my loaf of bread that I have here. What I probably want to do is to mirror it to the other side so that I have two different sides of it. So in our object tools that we've talked about using some of these so far, like the connect, but I'm going to use a new one called symmetry, and I'm going to put this in my symmetry here. And on this object, I actually have different tools or different mirror planes that I can use in order to mirror my spline. So I'm actually going to mirror it to the other side here. So now I have this sort of spline shape here, and let's see if I add this in an extrude object, what actually happens. So it looks like it disappeared in my scene, which is interesting to see, but sometimes that does happen. Let's see if I do hierarchy, will that actually work? No, so it looks like the extrude object didn't work in this case here. So what I might do, just to simplify it in this case here, is let's say I would to hit the C key so that it actually makes this a full object here. I make sure, okay, so it was because the spline path wasn't closed. That makes sense, honestly. Alright, so let's try it this way. I'll show you a bit more modeling here. So let's say I want to, we'll do this a simple way. I'm just going to copy this. So I'm going to copy this to the other side of here. And then I'm going to, on the x-axis, nope, z-axis, -1 to duplicate this. And we've talked about connecting objects together, which is sort of what we're going to do here. We're actually going to connect these two objects together so that they form one unit. So I'm going to select both of these, right click and go to connect objects, so that connects both of them together. And then I'm actually going to go into my point mode, and this is how we would manipulate the points of our different pieces here. But what I'm actually going to do is I'm actually going to select both of these points by drag selecting them, and then right clicking on my scene and going to join segments. And we're going to see how this might work in our scene. So right now it connected these both together, and if we look over here we can see that it's connected. It looks like it didn't quite work as well as I wanted to, so what I'm actually going to do is come into my front view here and select some of my points just so that I can fix this sort of shape here. Just because I know that when I go to use this later on, it's going to have some issues. So I actually just deleted one of those points just so that they're out of my way. So now I have this sort of loaf of bread sort of shape here, and I'm going to make sure to connect my object, close the spline so that the points at the bottom here are connected together. And now I should be able to extrude this out. So now I got this really sort of blocky sort of a loaf of bread shape here. And basically once I get here, I need to basically figure out how I want to smooth this out so that it feels more organic. So if I wanted to round the sides, obviously I would probably add some bevels in this to make it a bit rounder. I might also want to use something called a subdivision surface in order to smooth it out overall. Now of course you're gonna have to play with this in order to create sort of the perfect look that you want to have. So let's see if we can play around with this a little bit in order to mess with our pieces here. So now we got more of a shape of a bread here. Now there's definitely some things that I could be done to make this a bit more accurate per se. But once we get here, the thing that you might want to consider for getting things to look more organic, and this is something that I did in the taco shell, is the displacement object. So using a displacer object in your scene, and I'm going to group this together, I can actually basically give some sort of texture or feel to an object. So inside of the displacer object, there's actually a shading selection, and in here you can actually apply materials, images, or images specifically, in order to affect the shape of our object here. So once this comes back to me, because I opened up the window and I didn't really mean to, I'm actually going to add a material in here that I can use in order to manipulate the surface of my object. And the one that I'm going to choose is a noise. And basically this just creates sort of this random black and white sort of image here that's going to push the parts of my object around. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm actually going to give my surface here some bases so that it actually has a surface to actually push around. And now you can see that I have this sort of bumpily sort of shape here. Now by default this doesn't look really that good, which is why I have my subdivision surface so that I can actually make this a little bit more smoother here. So now I can get more of an organic feel. Now, of course, bread probably isn't that bumpily or whatever, so I probably would come into my displacer object and maybe lower the height of my displacer so that it's a bit more, you know, now it feels like it's a little bit more textured, but it's not so sort of uneven, and I'm not trying to create sort of like the surface of Mars or anything like that. So now I can actually create, you know, more of a feel to my bread or whatever the object is that you're trying to create more of a organic feel to it. Basically, the idea of making things seem more organic is to just making them seem not so uniform. You know, things in nature aren't perfect most of the time. Very rarely are they that perfect, that clean. So any sort of imperfections, scratches, you know, adjustments you can make to your models, either in 3D or after the fact, adds to the more organic feel of them. If you're saying trying to create a loaf of bread, maybe you want to use this to sort of, you know, create more holes on it. I mean, there's nothing to say that you can't, you know, use this in the other way and make more divots inside of the object. So the idea of making anything more organic is really just adding more imperfections to it. Of course, there is a limit to where that is, and some things work better than others in terms of how you're actually going to make it look. But yeah, so that would be the starting point for making things more organic. And of course, if you're trying to do bread, you probably would create a better loaf of bread shape than what I have here. So maybe bring in an image of an actual loaf of bread and trace it. That probably would give you sort of the best results rather than sort of freehanding it from scratch. But hopefully that helps a little bit in terms of making things more organic, even if it's not the best bread shape. And I will save this file just so that people can have a reference for using the displacer. Oh, and then another question we have here is, how do you color the outside and inside different colors? Oh, interesting. So on the extrude objects, you can use the same techniques that we've been using in terms of selections. So if I do have a selection here, I apply this here. Maybe I want the inside to be sort of a orangey faded color here. And I'm doing this in the wrong color channel, so I need to make sure to do this in the color channel here. So maybe I want that to be the inside part of my object here. So I'm going to make sure that this is on the shell, or the shell of mine, which I believe is S. Yeah, so let's see if this is actually going to work here. So I should just be able to put S here. Oh no, shell is the outside, so I actually want it to be the cap. So let's do C1. Yep, C1, and then I could duplicate this and make this C2. So I got it on the front and back, and then I'm going to duplicate this material and make a little bit of a darker for maybe the crust or the outer part of this, and apply this on here, drag it to the left side. So now I have sort of two-tone for my bread shape here. So if I had a better outline, this would look a little bit better, but you can see there we can have the inside and outside be different colors. And we saw earlier that if we really wanted this to have the shell to be a different color all on its own, we could bring this up here, maybe make this a bit darker, put this on here, make this S, and bring it on down here. Or is it over here? Yep, over here. So now we got 3 different colors on our object here. So obviously this probably isn't perfectly accurate to a real loaf of bread, but you can see here how we can start to manipulate the colors just like we have done on the text. So the extrude object and the text object, the ways that you do your selections are the same way. And if you ever forget what they are, just come to selections and you can turn on these here if you want to drag them in, or just use these letters as a guide for what you're going to put into the material selections for the objects here. So that's how you'd go about controlling your selections. And this is for And the core of this, again, is just a spline. It's just a spline that we have extruded. We have a subdivision surface on it, and that's just to make it smoother. And then we have a displacer to make it bumpy. And this is really, the displacer is just a visual way of doing this. You can do displacers, or more so what they're called displacements, on the materials as well. So if you notice in the materials, all the way at the bottom here, there is an option called displacer where you can actually do something very similar by adding your noise in here. The only difference is that this will only show on the render. This way shows you in the viewport. Sometimes one way is better than the other. It depends what you're going for. So I just want to make sure that everyone's aware of that there. Cool, so let me save this just so that it's an example that I can add to a Dropbox to share with everyone later on. But yeah, does anyone have, oh yeah, an image question. That's right, let me scroll back to that. Oh, so yeah, if we're doing an image, and this works for any render that you're using, because I know you do use another render image as well, but yeah, any image or any object you have in Cinema 4D, if you want to apply an image to it, it's pretty straightforward for the most part. You just have to add the image into the texture selection. So if I come into here and let me go into my example project here, let me add my Taco Bell image in here. Now I can apply this image to my plane here, and now I have my image inside of Cinema 4D. Now, of course, the size of this will be relative to what your actual image is created at. So, what was it, 1380 by 1050? Yeah, there we go. So, other way around, 1080 by 1350? Something like that. I don't think that's exactly the right numbers, but just like that, that's how you would actually adjust it to be the sizing for your image. And of course, once you have this ratio, you can make this smaller or bigger as you need to. So right now I'm just using the scale tool to bring this up and down, but you can use that sort of way in order to bring your images inside of Cinema 4D. So this could be a background plane, this could be, this could be on a cube, this could be on a sphere. Bring this on the sphere here. So of course, it may not look good on a sphere because you didn't design your image for a sphere, but you can go crazy with this. And whatever engine you're using, this pretty much goes the same sort of way. Some engines, you may not see it in your viewport, so don't freak out if you don't see it in your viewport. It usually means that it'll just come up only on render. But yeah, so that's just how you would add that in. And I think, just as a side note, I know someone asked about adding video inside of Cinema 4D. But if you do want to add, was it you? Okay, so if you do want to do video or whatever inside of Cinema 4D, there's actually a tab in your materials, and it's the same, it's similar in the other engines, but for anyone who's interested in doing it in general, there's an animation tab here, and you can actually bring in, usually what people do is they bring in an image sequence. I believe you can bring in an MP4, and it should play out, but I don't think I've done that before because I'm used to using image sequences. But you can select your image sequence here, and then once you have the image sequence in here, you can actually tell it to do simple, which is just play it out. You can tell it to loop, you can tell it to ping pong, and really all you have to do is come down here and select calculate, and it'll actually figure out the frames that you have in your image sequence automatically, as long as all the images are in the same folder. So that's the only thing. It has to be, together. It can't be all over the place, but as long as it's in the same folder and you have at least the first frame selected, it can figure out the animation, and then when you render out your scene over time, it'll play out your video. It won't have sound. You would have to add that back in post, or there are some ways to add sound in the Cinema 4D, at least in terms of timing, but they don't really get rendered out Okay, cool. Yeah, so yeah, if you're used to doing GIFs and image sequences, then you're pretty straight on that. I don't know if GIFs work. I have to try that. I wonder if GIFs work in here too. But and regardless, that's how you would get animation inside of Cinema 4D. So very similar process. As long as you can get an image in here, you can pretty much have at it. So cool. So there we go for that one. So I'll save this one just so that we have an example of this. Taco Bell images. Yeah. Oh yeah. So that's a good point there. So if anyone uses Media Encoder for Adobe, you can actually tell it to render out an image sequence of a video, and that would work perfectly fine. And it goes really quick too. So that's a good way to go about it. Awesome. Cool. So that's it for that part there.